Today we delve into one of those cases that breaks your heart. So let's get into it. Sometimes, those who live in solitude end up being marginalized by society and thus embark on the path of crime. But not everyone in this situation is capable of doing harm. Sometimes evil lies dormant for years without finding a way out. But in some, those inner demons emerge and unleash a series of bloody crimes that irreparably undermine trust in humanity and goodness. Lynette Volschenk, a 32-year-old South African, was one of these souls. She lived in a small town after moving from the capital. She loved nature, so she spent her time taking walks and shopping locally. She was a kind and sociable person, passionate about painting. Although she had few friends, a small group considered her extremely talented, educated, and open-minded. In the last 5 years before the tragedy, she lived in a suburb of Cape Town. Her apartment was on the 10th floor of a residential complex. On August 21, 2019, Lynette, 32 years old, did not show up for work. At that time, she worked for an engineering company. Her absence was immediately noticed by her superiors and colleagues, who tried to contact her by phone and through social media, but Lynette ignored all their calls and messages. This was not her usual behavior, as she had been working there for a long time and was one of the most reliable employees. Her colleagues noticed that she had been more active on social media and messages recently, so her silence seemed particularly suspicious. This worried many of her friends with whom she had formed bonds at work. However, no one managed to go to Lynette's house to check what had happened, attributing everything to urgent commitments or illness, so everyone waited for news from the woman. But Lynette would never return to work. On August 22nd, her younger sister, Crystal, for the second consecutive day, tried to contact Lynette, but she continued to ignore all calls and messages. In the end, worried, Crystal decided to go personally to her sister's apartment to find out what was happening. As she approached the front door, she heard suspicious noises coming from behind it. Understanding what was happening was impossible. At that moment, Crystal's anxiety turned into relief. She thought Lynette was at home and rang the doorbell, but instead of Lynette, she found herself facing a young stranger. That young man was wearing protective rubber gloves, and there was a strong smell of detergent coming from the sister's apartment. Crystal was surprised and tried to understand why there was a stranger in the apartment and who he was. The young man didn't introduce himself but calmly replied that Lynette herself had hired him for a general cleaning and had paid him to do it. Then he said he had to leave and would come back later. According to the man's statement, the landlady wasn't there, but she was supposed to return soon. Everything seemed suspicious to Crystal. The guy's jumpsuit was stained dark, but what worried her the most was the condition in which she found the apartment. She quickly scanned the walls and the floor and noticed suspicious brown stains, similar to dried blood, which also resembled those on the guy's clothes. He tried to deceive the girl by saying that Lynette had been arrested by the police for drug possession, which made no sense given Lynette's usual behavior, as she had never used illegal substances. After that, the young man attempted to flee, but the girl had no intention of letting him go. She stood in his way, made noise, and called the police. The neighbors, shocked by the circumstances, came out in response to her screams. Before law enforcement arrived, Crystal positioned herself in front of the door and did not allow the unknown guy to escape. When the patrol finally arrived in response to the call, they immediately entered the apartment and understood immediately why the guy was trying to flee. The stains on the walls and the floor were indeed blood. Most of the kitchen and hallway had been cleaned, and there was a strong smell of detergent in the apartment. Dried blood covered large areas in every room. Everything indicated that a crime had occurred there, and considering Lynette's absence, it was very likely a homicide. But this was quickly confirmed. As soon as they entered the bathroom, the detectives found body parts, some already packed in large garbage bags. The young man who was cleaning the apartment turned out to be Kyle Rutter, a neighbor who lived one floor below. Kyle was immediately arrested. His clothes worn during the cleaning were taken from him, and he was handcuffed and taken behind bars. The detectives were certain they had caught the murderer, but they still needed to confirm his involvement in the crime and gather evidence against him. They interviewed the victim's sister, Crystal, who confirmed that she had been unable to contact Lynette since August 21st. She confessed that she had come there to check on her sister herself, but instead found herself facing a stranger who opened the door for her. Kyle Rutter was born in Johannesburg, and from his childhood, he was abandoned by his biological parents. According to numerous accounts, they were substance abusers and showed no interest in the fate of their child. When life with his father and mother seemed dangerous for the child in the eyes of other relatives, they entrusted him to his grandmother to take care of him. Later on, the woman was no longer able to fully perform the assigned tasks, so the child was entrusted to his aunt named Teresa. This woman started raising him as if he were her own son and took him with her to Cape Town, where they settled on the 9th floor of the same residential complex where Lynette was later found. In that house, Kyle lived with his aunt for more than 10 years. Teresa, for many years, was a member of the criminal law college, earned a decent living, and invested a lot of money and energy in her nephew's education. Kyle completed high school at Winburg Boys High School, which was a rather well-known and prestigious school. In fact, this school was one of the best, and it is known that during his time there, Kyle was bullied by his classmates, which only stopped when he started playing sports and learned to stand up for himself. Kyle struggled to find a girlfriend for a long time and had difficulties in romantic relationships. However, this was not due to his physical appearance. He played sports and had even become a member of the hockey team. The hero of this story seemed quite attractive, but girls avoided him because of his strange character. In high school, he struggled with his studies, but thanks to his success in sports, he managed to enter university in 2016 when he was 21 years old. Friends described Kyle as a cheerful and determined guy who did his best to achieve his goals. From November 1st, 2018 to the end of June 2019, Kyle worked in a Christian bookstore located in a city shopping center, where colleagues described him as a friendly and sociable guy, ready to help others and competent in his field of work. The police were able to fairly quickly reconstruct the chain of events that led to the tragedy, completing the picture as they interviewed possible witnesses. Neighbors reported that around 5 p.m. on August 20th, a piercing scream was heard from Lynette's apartment, resembling a cry for help, but no one responded to that cry. Neighbors had noticed that several weeks before Lynette's death, young Kyle had been behaving suspiciously. They often saw him on the stairs, where he could observe Lynette's front door for extended periods. He tried to avoid encounters with other people in the residential complex. When asked what he was doing, Kyle would respond evasively and leave. At that time, no one suspected his malicious intentions. Now it is clear that all that time he could observe his future victim. It later emerged that the young man was carefully watching Lynette, analyzing her work schedule and daily routine when she woke up, when she went to the store, and so on. Before he decided to enact his bloody plan on August 20th, he ambushed his neighbor when she returned home from the supermarket, around 5 p.m., with her hands full of shopping bags. She struggled to open the door, but did not immediately close it behind her. Kyle was aware of this habit of hers, so he seized the opportunity and entered the apartment without any problems, following the unsuspecting woman. Lynette entered the kitchen and placed the shopping bags on the table. When she turned around, she found the criminal in front of her, who attacked her without warning. Lynette tried to fight back, appearing to be stronger than the criminal expected. At that point, the boy grabbed one of the kitchen knives and began to stab her. Lynette continued to fight, but realized the situation was critical. At that moment, the neighbors heard her screams for help. Then Kyle managed to inflict several fatal blows on the victim. After that, she could no longer call for help, and the woman's screams did not attract the neighbors' attention. Residents of the same building also confirmed that on that day, in addition to the screams coming from Lynette's apartment, they also heard other suspicious sounds. It sounded like dull hammer blows. In reality, they were the sounds of movement and dismemberment of the body. Kyle dragged her into the bathroom and then began to dismember the body with a saw. The neighbors heard all those sounds but ignored them, as well as the victim's cries for help, attributing everything to possible renovation work that the landlady might have decided to do. Forensic examinations revealed a large number of wounds on the arms, many of which were typical of defensive actions. After the victim began to lose strength and resistance, Kyle inflicted several knife wounds to the throat, ultimately causing her to lose consciousness and bleed to death. Considering the extent of the wounds, it was now impossible to help her. The criminal's plan was far from complete. He understood that he needed to somehow dispose of the body and conceal the traces of the crime. Kyle believed that the most effective way would be to dismember the victim into smaller parts and gradually dispose of them, abandoning them in various locations around the city. All these pieces of evidence were promptly found by investigators in the victim's apartment. In the bathroom, there were numerous black bags and a handsaw used for dissection. Here, the investigators also found a knife that, after forensic examination, was confirmed to have been used for the murder. It was known that Kyle's aunt was absent during that period, so he had planned his attack when she was away for a few days for work. He was in no rush and calmly proceeded with the dismemberment of the body. On the day of the murder, the criminal cut the victim, separating the head, arms, and legs from the torso, which had been divided into smaller parts to facilitate transportation out of the residential complex. He ended up with 9 bags. Some of these he placed in his cooler bag, which was found in the victim's bedroom. Part of the remains was transported to his own home on the 9th floor. After this massive process, he was exhausted and went to bed around 10 p.m. on the same day. The next morning, he went to the supply store where he purchased gloves, cleaning products, and a jumpsuit to work freely with detergents. Then he returned to the victim's apartment. The entire apartment was flooded with blood. Initially, he decided to dispose of Lynette's torso. Kyle put the bag in his small backpack and, along with it, left the victim's apartment, heading for a short walk near the residential complex. In a park, he tossed the bag into the bushes. The criminal behaved recklessly and ended up on many surveillance cameras. He was easily traced, and his backpack with Lynette's head was discovered just a few hundred meters from his home. The killer cleaned the blood from his body with towels, which he simply threw into the residential complex's garbage bin. During this period, neighbors saw him leaving with the cooler bag. Kyle returned home by another route, apparently to confuse the tracks, but his movements were too obvious. Of course, his most disastrous move was opening the door to the victim's sister, Crystal. It's hard to say what he was thinking when he decided to show up at the victim's sister's wearing a blood-stained jumpsuit and carrying cleaning products while her sister was missing. When the police arrived at the scene, they were already familiar with this residential building, as just 2 months earlier, Anthony Mary, 65, had been found dead. During the investigation, detectives discovered that the criminal had entered through an emergency entrance used for evacuations in case of fire. The deceased man had been tied to a chair with a rope. However, no suspects emerged in this case. Now, suspicions arose that Anthony's death could be one of the events in a series of bloody murders perpetrated by Kyle. Lynette's murder shocked all the residents of the condominium, especially her Aunt Teresa. Initially, the woman refused to believe that her nephew was capable of such an act, but after examining the case material, she realized that he was truly behind this crime. Teresa was extremely disturbed by the media attention, and journalists approached her multiple times to try to uncover the details of what happened. However, Teresa refused to comment and threatened legal action against several television channels that had taken pictures of her and were about to publish them. Apparently, she considered such behavior a threat and requested to limit the use of the photos, including those of Kyle. However, she failed to do so, as the police were obligated to inform local residents about such crimes, providing them with photographic materials. When Kyle appeared in court, he was greeted with insults and threats from the crowd, but the criminal remained calm. His impassive face showed no emotion. During the hearing, it emerged that the boy had no criminal record and had not had any run-ins with the law in the past. The judge also authorized photographs of the boy, as he was clearly involved in Lynette's murder. After this hearing, the trial was postponed because not all the forensic reports were ready. The victim's family struggled with the pain of loss and could not be present in court for some time. They felt deep sadness and anger toward the criminal. At the lawyer's suggestion, authorities were seriously discussing the possibility of granting bail, keeping Kyle under house arrest until the trial began. This sparked a wave of protests among residents, as the incident was an act of extreme cruelty and violence, not motivated by aggression. The murderer clearly posed a threat to society. On September 7th, the funeral ceremony and tributes to the crime victim were held. Many friends, relatives, and co-workers who had close ties to the victim attended the event. During this time, investigators were actively working to gather evidence, including DNA samples, of which there was a large amount at the crime scene. While the forensic examinations were underway, the 2020 pandemic erupted, causing significant delays in the judicial system. During this period, Kyle's legal representation was changed, and a psychiatric evaluation was ordered. Afterward, he began speaking with psychiatrists and specialists, who concluded that, despite some deviations, the young man was fully capable of understanding and willing before the court. However, he clearly exhibited manipulative behavior, constantly lying and changing his version of events. Despite the official conclusion, his new lawyer requested a new psychiatric examination, arguing that Kyle was unable to understand and needed treatment rather than incarceration. As a result, it was decided to admit Kyle to a psychiatric hospital. However, due to lockdown-related issues and a high number of patients, everything was stalled for a whopping 12 months. Only when the lockdown was lifted did things start moving more swiftly. However, the examination could only be initiated after 3 months, and Kyle was provided a room for observation for 30 days, which unfortunately extended to 2 months. Only in February 2021, Kyle was once again deemed capable of understanding and willing, and he declared himself ready to appear before a jury. Despite previous psychiatric conclusions, the murderer's attorney requested further examination by an independent specialist, intending to focus on Kyle's deviations that led him to commit the crime. This request led to further delays in waiting for hearings. Kyle was transferred to another prison, but once again, he was declared capable of understanding and willing. The prosecution's witness list included about 60 people, mainly neighbors who had seen Kyle following the victim. It was established that not only did he kill the defenseless woman, but he was also charged with desecration of the corpse and theft, since he actively used the victim's personal effects in an attempt to eliminate evidence. The trial began on May 9, 2023, and for a long time, Kyle vehemently denied his guilt. Despite all the evidence presented by the prosecution, a plea deal was proposed. They offered the suspect to admit guilt to premeditated murder, desecration of a corpse, and attempted obstruction of justice. In exchange, charges of theft, production, and possession of counterfeit money would be dropped. The criminal accepted the deal. In the plea agreement document, Kyle detailed his murder of the neighbor. He stated that he did not have a close relationship with the victim, but nevertheless chose Lynette as his first victim. He was unable to explain the timing of that moment, but admitted to acting out of sheer opportunity, with Lynette being a convenient victim living nearby. Kyle had planned the attack for a long time, observing, stalking, and analyzing the behavior of the future victim. He had studied court cases where murderers had managed to evade the police for a long time, trying to learn from them to avoid making mistakes. However, despite his efforts, he failed to consider the number of surveillance cameras that caught him in action. He also argued that the murder was not an act of cruelty, but rather a mistake caused by his financial situation. In 2019, he had serious drug addiction problems and owed a large sum of money to his dealer, about 30,000 South African rand. To solve his financial problems, he had initially attempted to print counterfeit money, but then decided to kill someone and sell their belongings to cover his debt. The prosecution argued that this was a premeditated and cold-blooded murder, but the suspect insisted that his main goal was Lynette's car keys, which he intended to sell. He regretted his mistake, calling it a misunderstanding, but the evidence contradicted him. The court considered Kyle a particularly dangerous criminal, so the trial was postponed until October 2023. A new 30-day psychiatric examination was required, and rumors circulated that during his detention awaiting trial, Kyle had become a member of one of the most dangerous prison gangs, known as 28, as evidenced by a tattoo found on his inner wrist. However, Kyle denied being initiated into the gang. Instead, he claimed to have been under the influence of substances during the attack, which gave him courage and strength. In November 2023, a psychiatric report labeled him as a particularly dangerous criminal and revealed that Kyle was lying about his remorse for the murder. He also expressed apologies to Lynette's family, but everyone believed they were just to seek a lighter sentence. Only after 4 years and 3 months from the heinous murder, the murderer finally received a life sentence for murder, plus 15 years for desecration of the body and 5 for attempted tampering with evidence. Despite all the evidence presented by the prosecution, they insisted that the case materials in Kyle's dossier include photos of the crime scene. The prosecution believed that this would allow all participants in the trial to understand the monster standing before them. If ever granted parole, This would likely prevent the parole board from making hasty decisions. In reality, there were all reasons to believe that Kyle was extremely dangerous. During the search of his apartment, numerous law and forensic medicine books were found, which could have belonged to Teresa, who was a criminal defense attorney. It was her field, but she denied that those materials were hers. However, the most concerning evidence was found directly in Kyle's room, particularly several notebooks with his handwriting. In them, he fantasized about rapes and numerous murders. The most disturbing notebook contained the names of 19 women, and he labeled himself as a master of manipulation. He closely monitored their every move and habit, noting down details of their schedules and filming them. It was evident that Kyle was planning a series of crimes and preparing meticulously to avoid capture by law enforcement. He had a particular interest in the activities of famous serial killers like Ted Bundy, Jeffrey Dahmer, and Edmund Kemper. However, he was particularly fascinated by the successes of the Zodiac, who was never caught. Fortunately, he failed and didn't manage to attack other women. There was no evidence of the aspiring serial killer's involvement in the murder of another resident of the building, Anthony Morey. Kyle fantasized and planned murders of women in his notebooks, so it was debatable if the murder of a man was part of his plans. However, this possibility couldn't be completely ruled out, and so far, Kyle is considered the prime suspect in this case.